That fake check isn't worth the paper it's printed on. The words cracked through the bank lobby so sharply that even the clicking keyboards seemed to stop. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Richard Collins smiled, tore the $2 million check cleanly in half, and let the pieces flutter toward the polished marble floor. A gasp rolled through the room. Some customers stared. Others instinctively reached for their phones. Near the customer service desk, an elderly woman pressed a hand against her mouth. At the far end of the lobby, a young teller froze mid-step, a stack of documents trembling slightly in her hands. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the 20-foot glass windows, painting golden reflections across the floor, but somehow the entire room felt colder. Standing at the center of it all was Elijah Brooks. The 60-year-old black farmer remained perfectly still. Dust from the Georgia countryside still clung faintly to the cuffs of his denim jacket. His work boots carried traces of dried earth. His weathered hands hung calmly at his sides. He looked less like someone depositing millions of dollars and more like a man who had spent the morning repairing a fence line before driving into the city. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and shook his head as if the situation were beneath him. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. A $2 million check. A few uncomfortable chuckles drifted from somewhere in the crowd. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He simply glanced down at the torn pieces resting on the marble floor. The check had taken years to earn. Years of droughts. Years of storms. Years of watching neighbors sell their land while he stayed. Yet his face revealed none of that. No anger. No embarrassment. No panic. Just silence. Richard interpreted the silence as weakness. "Sir," he continued, folding his arms across his chest, "people don't just walk in off a tractor and deposit $2 million. The words lingered in the air. A young mother standing nearby frowned. Even the security guard near the entrance shifted uneasily. Something about the exchange felt wrong. Elijah slowly lifted his eyes. They were calm, steady, and surprisingly kind. "I only asked for verification," he said quietly. His voice carried no bitterness, no challenge, just simple truth. Richard laughed once. Short, dismissive. "Verification?" He gestured toward the torn paper on the floor. "There's your verification." The bank lobby fell silent again. Outside, traffic moved along the avenue. A city bus hissed to a stop. Somewhere beyond the glass, life continued normally. Inside, time seemed suspended. The young teller who had frozen earlier looked from Elijah to Richard and back again. Something didn't fit. The farmer didn't look frightened. He didn't look desperate. If anything, he looked almost sad. Not because of the check. Not because of the humiliation. Because of Richard. As though he had seen this moment before. As though he already knew how it would end. Then, from somewhere near the entrance, a woman's voice broke the silence. It was barely above a whisper, yet somehow everyone heard it. "Oh no," she murmured. Her eyes had locked onto Elijah Brooks. And suddenly, the color drained from her face. The woman took a hesitant step forward, her eyes never leaving Elijah. She looked to be in her early 50s, dressed in a navy business suit with a silver name badge pinned neatly to her jacket. The moment she recognized him, something shifted in her expression. It was not surprise. It was respect. Deep respect. Richard noticed immediately. His smile faded slightly. "Karen," he asked, "do you know this man?" The woman swallowed hard. "I think everyone in this bank should know who he is." A murmur spread through the lobby. Elijah lowered his gaze again, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Karen Walker had worked at Whitmore National Bank for nearly 28 years. She had seen governors, celebrities, professional athletes, and billionaires walk through these doors. Yet she had never spoken in that tone before. Richard frowned. "Then perhaps you would like to explain." Karen looked at Elijah as if asking permission. He offered a small nod. Nothing more. She drew a slow breath. 5 years ago, when my husband was diagnosed with cancer, we lost almost everything. The room grew quiet. Even customers pretending not to listen found themselves paying attention. Insurance denied part of his treatment. We were preparing to sell our house. Karen paused, her voice catching slightly. Then someone anonymously paid every remaining medical bill. Richard blinked. "What does that have to do with this?" Karen looked directly at him. The person who paid them was Mr. Brooks. Several heads turned toward Elijah. The farmer shifted uncomfortably. He clearly had no interest in being discussed. Richard laughed once. but this time it sounded forced. You were telling me that a farmer paid hospital bills large enough to save a family home. Not just mine, Karen replied. 3 others that year alone. Silence followed. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead. Outside, sunlight glinted off passing cars. Elijah stood quietly in the center of the lobby as though the conversation were happening about someone else entirely. Richard straightened his tie. Generosity is admirable. It does not make a $2 million check legitimate. Karen stared at him. For the first time, disappointment replaced respect in her eyes. You still do not understand. Before Richard could answer, Elijah finally spoke. It is all right, Karen. His voice was calm and steady. You do not owe anyone an explanation. The simplicity of the statement somehow made the room feel even quieter. Karen nodded and stepped back. Elijah glanced down at the torn pieces still scattered across the marble floor. Slowly, he bent his knees and began gathering them one by one. Customers watched in silence. No anger, no demands, no threats. Just a 60-year-old man carefully collecting scraps of paper. Richard checked his watch. He was already irritated by the attention. A regional promotion review was only weeks away. Every decision mattered. Every appearance mattered. He could not afford to look uncertain. Sir, Elijah said softly while picking up another piece. I would still appreciate verification of the account. Richard exhaled sharply. There is nothing to verify. Elijah looked up. His expression remained unchanged. You have not checked. Those 4 words landed harder than anyone expected. The young teller near the counter lowered her eyes. Richard felt several employees watching him now. Waiting. Judging. The atmosphere had shifted. Then the main entrance doors opened again. Cool afternoon air drifted inside. Several people instinctively turned toward the sound. A man in a dark suit entered first, scanning the lobby. Another followed behind him. Then a third. The conversation throughout the bank stopped almost instantly. Karen's eyes widened. Elijah remained calm. But Richard suddenly felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Because those men were not customers. They were executives from corporate headquarters. The 3 executives moved through the lobby with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to being recognized. Their polished shoes clicked softly across the marble floor. Dark tailored suits. Silver cufflinks. Corporate identification badges. The kind of people who normally stayed several floors above everyone else. Conversations died almost instantly. Employees straightened their posture. Customers stepped aside. Richard felt a flicker of satisfaction return. Corporate visits happened from time to time. Usually they reflected well on branch leadership. Usually, he adjusted his jacket and walked forward with a practiced smile. Good afternoon, he said. Welcome to Whitmore National. The first executive offered a polite nod, but did not stop. Neither did the second. All 3 continued walking directly past Richard. His smile froze. A strange silence settled over the lobby. Richard turned slightly, watching them continue toward the center of the room. Toward Elijah. Karen noticed it first. Her hand tightened around the folder she was carrying. The young teller noticed it next. Then the security guard. One by one, heads turned. Elijah had finished gathering the torn pieces of paper. He stood slowly, placing the fragments neatly inside a worn leather envelope. The executives approached him with visible respect. Not fear. Not obligation. Respect. The oldest executive, a gray-haired man named Thomas Granger, stopped a few feet away and extended his hand. Mr. Brooks, he said warmly. I am glad we found you. Richard felt his stomach tighten. He knew Granger by reputation alone. Senior Vice President. 32 years with the bank. A man who rarely traveled unless something important was happening. Elijah shook his hand gently. Good afternoon, Thomas. The casual familiarity between them made several employees exchange nervous glances. Richard forced a laugh. Mr. Granger, is there some confusion? Thomas looked at him for the first time. The warmth vanished from his expression. Confusion, he repeated. Perhaps. Richard gestured toward Elijah. This gentleman attempted to deposit an unverified instrument. He chose his words carefully. Professional. Controlled. I was simply protecting the bank. Thomas remained silent for a moment. The quiet felt heavier than any argument. Finally, he looked toward the envelope in Elijah's hands. May I see what remains of the document? Elijah handed it over without hesitation. Thomas opened it carefully. His eyes moved across the torn pieces. Then he closed the envelope and exhaled slowly. Not anger. Disappointment. Deep disappointment. Richard suddenly wished the lobby were not so quiet. He wished customers were not recording. He wished his employees were not watching every second. The original was authentic, Thomas said. Richard blinked. Excuse me. The original was authentic. The words echoed through the room. Richard felt heat rise in his face. That is impossible. Thomas tilted his head. Impossible. He reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. The funds were verified this morning through corporate authorization. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard stared at the folder. Corporate authorization. Those words carried weight. Procedures. Reviews. Multiple approvals. Layers of verification. Not something a branch manager could casually dismiss. Elijah remained completely calm. He did not smile. He did not appear vindicated. He simply stood there while the truth unfolded around him. Thomas opened the folder and reviewed a page. In fact, he continued, the transaction was flagged for special handling several days ago. Richard swallowed. The knot in his stomach grew tighter. Across the lobby, Karen slowly closed her eyes. She already knew what was coming. The young teller looked almost afraid to breathe. Then Thomas lifted his gaze from the documents and spoke the sentence that changed everything. Mr. Brooks was scheduled to meet with executive leadership personally this afternoon. The words settled over the lobby like a sudden change in weather. Executive leadership. Customers who had been quietly watching now stared openly. Employees exchanged uncertain looks. Even the security guard near the entrance shifted his weight, unsure whether he should remain where he was or disappear entirely. Richard felt the confidence draining from his posture one drop at a time. There must be some mistake, he said carefully. Thomas Granger closed the folder. There is a mistake, he replied. But it is not the one you think. The lobby fell silent again. Elijah stood with the same calm expression he had worn from the beginning. It was almost unsettling. Most people would have been angry by now. Most people would have demanded answers. Most people would have wanted someone punished. Yet Elijah seemed more concerned about keeping everyone comfortable than proving himself right. Thomas glanced toward him. Mr. Brooks, I apologize for the inconvenience. Elijah offered a small smile. No need, Thomas. The older executive looked genuinely troubled. I disagree. Richard swallowed hard. Every second felt longer than the last. He noticed several employees avoiding eye contact with him now. The young teller who had looked nervous earlier appeared almost heartbroken. She understood what was happening before anyone else did. This was no ordinary customer. Thomas turned toward the staff. Can someone bring Mr. Brooks a chair? Before anyone could move, Elijah raised a hand gently. I am fine standing. Are you sure? Thomas asked. I am sure. The simple exchange revealed something Richard could not quite understand. The executives were treating Elijah with the kind of courtesy normally reserved for major investors or board members. Yet there was no arrogance in the farmer. No expectation of special treatment. If anything, he seemed embarrassed by the attention. Hey! Faint vibration buzzed from Thomas's phone. He checked the screen and immediately straightened. They are here. Karen's eyes widened slightly. Richard felt another wave of unease. Who is here? He asked. Thomas looked at him. The people you were supposed to be preparing for. Before Richard could respond, the glass entrance doors opened once more. Afternoon sunlight flooded across the marble floor. Several individuals entered together. 2 assistants. A legal advisor. Then a woman with silver-streaked hair and a navy blazer stepped through the doorway. The atmosphere changed instantly. Employees stood straighter. Conversations stopped completely. There was no need for introductions. Everyone recognized Margaret Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore National Bank. Richard's pulse quickened. The CEO rarely visited branches. Most managers spent entire careers without seeing her in person. Yet here she was. Margaret surveyed the lobby for less than 2 seconds before her eyes found Elijah. The tension in her face disappeared immediately. A warm smile appeared instead. Not a corporate smile. Not the practiced smile used in advertisements. Something real. Something personal. She walked directly toward him. Richard instinctively stepped forward. Ms. Whitmore, I can explain. She passed him without slowing down. The movement was subtle, but it felt devastating. Margaret stopped in front of Elijah and extended both hands. Mr. Brooks, she said softly, I have been looking forward to seeing you all week. The room became completely still. Elijah shook her hand. It is good to see you too, Margaret. Richard closed his eyes briefly. First Thomas. Now the CEO herself. both speaking to Elijah as an equal, as a friend, as someone important. Then Margaret noticed the leather envelope in Elijah's hand. Her smile faded. "What happened?" she asked quietly. No one answered. No one needed to. Her eyes moved downward toward the torn pieces visible inside the envelope. For the first time since entering the building, her expression hardened. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The entire lobby seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Margaret Whitmore kept her eyes on the torn pieces inside the envelope. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished marble floor, but the warmth of the afternoon no longer reached the room. Richard felt every employee watching him, every customer, every executive. The silence became unbearable. "Margaret," Elijah said gently, "it is all right." His voice was calm, almost reassuring. The CEO looked up at him. "No, it is not." The firmness in her tone surprised everyone. She turned toward Thomas Granger. "Tell me exactly what happened." Nobody volunteered. Nobody moved. Finally, Karen Walker stepped forward. Her voice remained respectful, but it carried enough weight to fill the room. She explained the arrival, the request for verification, the assumptions, the dismissal, the torn check. Each sentence landed like another stone dropped into still water. Richard stared at the floor. By the time she finished speaking, the lobby felt smaller somehow. Margaret listened without interruption. When Karen finished, the CEO folded her hands quietly. Then she looked directly at Richard. "Did you verify the account?" Richard opened his mouth, closed it, then finally answered. "No." "Did you contact corporate?" "No." "Did you review the authorization file?" His throat tightened. "No." Margaret nodded once. Not angry, not loud. Somehow that made it worse. "Then every decision you made today was based on an assumption." Richard felt heat rising into his face. He wanted to explain. He wanted to defend himself. Yet every possible explanation sounded weaker than the last. Meanwhile, Elijah remained completely still. No satisfaction, no triumph, just patience. The same patience that had been there from the beginning. Thomas Granger shifted slightly and opened another folder. "There is something else," he said. Margaret looked toward him. "Go ahead." Thomas removed several documents. "Mr. Brooks is not only depositing proceeds from the land agreement." Murmurs spread through the room. Richard lifted his head. "Land agreement?" Thomas continued. "This afternoon's executive meeting was scheduled because Mr. Brooks was considering a major investment partnership with the bank's Rural Development Initiative." Several employees exchanged surprised looks. The initiative was one of the largest projects in the company's history. Hundreds of small farming communities across multiple states would benefit from it. Thomas glanced toward Elijah. "The proposed commitment exceeds $20 million over the next several years." A collective breath seemed to leave the room all at once. $20 million. Richard felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Customers who had been recording lowered their phones in disbelief. The young teller covered her mouth. Even some executives appeared impressed. Yet Elijah looked uncomfortable again. "The money is not the important part," he said quietly. Thomas smiled. "That is exactly why it matters." Margaret nodded. "You always say the same thing." Elijah shrugged lightly. "Because it is true." For a moment the tension eased. Then Margaret looked around the lobby. Her gaze settled on the employees standing behind the counters. "Do you know why I asked Mr. Brooks to meet with us personally?" Nobody answered. The CEO's expression softened. "Because for 30 years he has invested in people before he invested in himself." The room fell silent once more. Richard slowly looked toward the farmer he had dismissed. For the first time all afternoon, he stopped seeing worn boots, dusty denim, and an old pickup truck. He began seeing something else entirely. And what he saw made him feel smaller than he ever had before. The lobby grew quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The tension that had filled the room for the last hour seemed to dissolve into something heavier. Reflection. The bright afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble floor in long golden bands, touching polished counters, leather chairs, and the scattered shadows of people standing perfectly still. Nobody seemed eager to speak. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever invisible truth had settled over the room. Elijah looked toward the tall windows facing the street. Outside, the city moved forward without noticing any of this. Cars rolled through intersections. Pedestrians carried shopping bags. A delivery truck stopped at a red light. Ordinary. Life continued. He found comfort in that. The world was bigger than one bad afternoon. Bigger than one misunderstanding. Bigger than one person's opinion. Margaret noticed him staring outside. "You are thinking about leaving already, are you not?" she asked softly. A few people smiled despite the tension. Elijah returned a small smile of his own. "The cows still need feeding." A light ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. Even Thomas Granger chuckled. The sound broke the pressure hanging over everyone. For a brief moment, the room felt human again. Margaret shook her head. "You are discussing $20 million, and your first concern is livestock." Elijah shrugged. "They were depending on me long before the money showed up." Another quiet laugh moved through the room. Richard remained silent. He stood several feet away, watching, listening. The words hit him harder than the financial numbers ever could, because they revealed something simple. Elijah's priorities had never changed. Success had not changed them. Wealth had not changed them. Recognition had not changed them. Richard found himself looking down at his own polished shoes. Suddenly, they seemed unimportant. The expensive watch on his wrist felt unimportant too. The title on his office door. The promotion he had spent years chasing. None of it seemed connected to the respect Elijah had earned. Karen slowly walked toward a nearby chair and sat down. Her eyes glistened slightly. She remembered the hospital bills. The fear. The nights wondering how her family would survive. Elijah had helped without asking for credit. Without asking for recognition. Most people in the room were learning about it for the first time. That fact alone said everything. Thomas closed his folder and stepped beside Elijah near the windows. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked. Elijah smiled faintly. "You were trying to convince me not to close my account." Thomas laughed. "I was failing badly." Several employees listened with curiosity. "What happened?" one of them asked. Thomas looked toward the young teller. 22 years ago, this man walked into a small branch carrying less than $500. The room became attentive again. Most people overlooked him. One employee did not. Thomas paused. That employee eventually became a branch manager, then a regional director, then an executive. Elijah nodded quietly. She treated everyone the same. Margaret folded her arms and looked toward the employees. That is how leadership begins. The statement lingered in the air. No presentation. No corporate slogan. Just a simple truth. Sunlight continued pouring through the windows as the afternoon slowly moved forward. For the first time all day, the lobby felt peaceful. Yet Richard could not shake the feeling growing inside him. Because the more he learned about Elijah Brooks, the less he could understand how he had failed to see any of it when the man first walked through the door. Richard stood motionless near the customer service desk while the conversations around him seemed to drift farther away. The sunlight still filled the lobby. The executives were still speaking with Elijah. Employees were still listening. Yet none of it felt close anymore. His attention remained fixed on a single question he could not escape. How had he gotten this so wrong? The answer arrived slowly and painfully. Not through accusations. Not through public humiliation. Through truth. He replayed the afternoon in his mind. The dusty boots. The worn jacket. The old pickup truck parked outside. The quiet voice asking for verification. Every detail he had used to form a judgment suddenly seemed shallow. Worse than shallow. Lazy. For years Richard had convinced himself he was good at reading people. He believed success had taught him that skill. But now he realized he had not been reading people at all. He had been reading appearances. Across the lobby, Margaret Whitmore was listening as Elijah described plans for expanding agricultural education programs in rural counties. There was no discussion about luxury purchases. No talk about status. No interest in showing wealth. Every idea centered on helping communities survive difficult years. Small farms. Young families. Local schools. The more Richard listened, the worse he felt. Then Thomas Granger glanced toward one of the assistants. "Has Daniel arrived yet?" The assistant nodded. "He is parking now." Elijah smiled faintly. "I have not seen that young man in years." Margaret laughed softly. "He is not young anymore." Several employees exchanged curious looks. Richard frowned. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Less than a minute later, the entrance doors opened once again. A tall man in his early 40s stepped inside wearing a charcoal suit. He carried himself with confidence. But there was warmth in his expression that immediately stood apart from most executives. The moment he spotted Elijah, his face lit up. "Mr. Brooks." He crossed the lobby quickly and shook Elijah's hand with both of his. "It is good to see you." "You too, Daniel," Elijah replied. Richard suddenly felt his pulse quicken. Daniel Whitmore, son of the CEO, future leader of the company. Everyone in the organization knew his name. Daniel looked around the room and noticed the unusual atmosphere. "Did I miss something?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Margaret and Thomas exchanged a glance. Daniel looked from one face to another until his eyes settled on the envelope containing the torn pieces of paper. His smile faded. "What happened?" Again, silence. Finally, Margaret explained the situation in a few calm sentences. Daniel listened carefully. When she finished, he turned toward Elijah. "I am sorry." Elijah shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for." Daniel smiled sadly. "Maybe not personally, but still." He paused before continuing. "My family owes you more than an apology." The room became quiet once more. Richard felt another wave of confusion. Daniel looked around the lobby before speaking. "Most of you probably do not know this." His voice was calm. 29 years ago, I nearly died during a flood outside Albany County." Employees exchanged surprised looks. Customers listened closely. Daniel continued. "The man who pulled me from the water and carried me nearly half a mile to safety was Mr. Brooks." Complete silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Richard stared at Elijah as the final piece of the puzzle slid into place. The respect, the friendship, the personal invitations, the trust. Suddenly it all made sense. And standing there beneath the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by people who now understood the truth, Richard realized he had not simply misjudged a customer. He had misjudged one of the most important people his company's leadership had ever known. The revelation settled over the lobby like a wave moving through still water. No one rushed to speak. No one reached for a phone. Even the customers who had spent the afternoon watching from a distance seemed to understand that something bigger than a banking transaction had just unfolded in front of them. Daniel Whitmore stood beside Elijah with genuine gratitude in his eyes. "I was 11 years old," he said quietly. "The river had overflowed after 3 straight days of rain. My father was away on business. My mother thought she was going to lose me." His voice softened. "Mr. Brooks never told anyone what he did. We found out later from the rescue team." Elijah looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." Daniel smiled. "That is not true. Plenty of people drove away that day." The room fell silent again. Margaret Whitmore looked toward her son, then back to Elijah. "My family has spent nearly 3 decades trying to repay a debt that cannot be measured." Elijah shook his head. "There is no debt." "That is exactly what someone like you would say," Margaret replied. Richard felt every word like a weight pressing against his chest. He looked around the lobby and noticed something he had missed all afternoon. Nobody respected Elijah because of money. Nobody respected him because of influence. They respected him because of who he was when nobody was watching. The realization stung more than any professional criticism ever could. Slowly, Richard stepped forward. The movement immediately drew attention. He stopped several feet from Elijah. For a moment, he seemed unable to find the right words. The branch manager who had spent years speaking confidently in meetings suddenly looked uncertain. "Human. Mr. Brooks," he began quietly. His voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I owe you an apology." The lobby became completely still. Richard lowered his eyes briefly before forcing himself to continue. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I saw your clothes. I saw your truck. I saw what I expected to see." He paused. "And I was wrong." No one interrupted. No one rescued him from the discomfort. Richard continued. "I did not treat you with the dignity every person deserves. For that, I am deeply sorry." The words hung in the air. Genuine. Unrehearsed. Elijah studied him for a moment. Sunlight reflected softly across the marble floor between them. Then the farmer nodded. "Thank you. That was all. No lecture. No humiliation. No demand for consequences. Just 2 simple words." Richard blinked. "That is it." Elijah smiled gently. "What more would you like me to say?" Several people laughed quietly. The tension eased again. Richard managed a small smile of his own. It was the first honest smile he had worn all afternoon. Margaret watched the exchange carefully. "Most people would not have handled this with such grace," she said. Elijah shrugged. "Carrying anger is heavy. I already spend enough time carrying feed bags." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Even Thomas Granger chuckled. The atmosphere softened completely. Yet beneath the laughter, everyone understood the lesson. Elijah had every reason to seek revenge. Every reason to embarrass the man who had embarrassed him. Instead, he chose something else. Understanding, mercy, perspective, and somehow, that choice left a stronger impression than any punishment ever could. The afternoon was beginning to fade when the meeting finally ended. The crowd that had gathered throughout the day slowly returned to their routines. Customers resumed conversations. Employees drifted back toward their desks. Phones started ringing again. The bank was becoming a bank once more. Yet something had changed. Something that could not be measured on a balance sheet or recorded in a quarterly report. Near the tall windows, the last rays of sunlight stretched across the marble floor, casting long shadows that seemed softer than before. Elijah finished signing the final documents and slipped the pen back across the table. Thomas carefully organized the paperwork while Margaret reviewed the partnership agreement one last time. Everything was complete. The investment initiative would move forward. Hundreds of farming families across several states would receive support. New educational programs would be funded. Small communities that had struggled for years would finally have opportunities many thought were impossible. Elijah looked over the documents briefly and nodded. That should help a lot of people. Margaret smiled. It will. Daniel stood nearby with his hands in his pockets. You always think about everyone else first. Elijah chuckled quietly. That usually works out better. A few feet away, Richard remained standing near the customer service area. He had spent the last hour reflecting more deeply than he had in years. Titles, promotions, performance reviews. None of those things felt as important now as the simple lesson he had learned in a single afternoon. Eventually, he walked over one final time. Mr. Brooks. Elijah turned. Yes. Richard hesitated, then extended his hand. I hope if you ever come back here, you will give us another chance. Elijah looked at the offered hand and smiled warmly. Then he shook it. Everyone deserves another chance. Richard nodded slowly. Those words would stay with him long after the day ended. Outside, the city was beginning to glow beneath the colors of sunset. The sky carried shades of gold, orange, and deep blue. Through the glass, Elijah could see traffic moving steadily along the avenue. Somewhere beyond the skyline, hundreds of miles away, his farm was waiting. The cattle still needed feeding. Fences still needed checking. Morning would come early. Some things never changed. Margaret walked with him toward the entrance. Daniel followed beside her. No reporters. No ceremony. No grand announcement. Just quiet respect. When they reached the doors, Margaret paused. Thank you, she said. Elijah looked surprised. For what? She glanced toward the lobby behind them. Employees were working. Customers were talking. Richard stood quietly near his office. For reminding everyone what leadership actually looks like. Elijah smiled. The expression was small but genuine. Leadership is easy, he said. Just remember people matter more than appearances. Then he stepped outside. Cool evening air greeted him. The sounds of the city felt distant and calm. Behind him, the glass doors closed softly. Inside, people watched him walk toward the old pickup truck parked at the curb. There was nothing impressive about the vehicle. No luxury badge. No polished shine. Just years of honest work etched into every panel. Elijah climbed inside and started the engine. For a moment, he sat there watching the fading sunlight reflect across the bank's windows. Then he drove away. Back inside the lobby, nobody spoke. Margaret stood beside her son. Thomas held his folder against his chest. Richard stared through the glass. The truck became smaller as it disappeared into the evening traffic. Finally, it was gone. Yet the silence that remained did not feel empty. It felt like justice. Quiet. Undeniable. And impossible to ignore.